The Force is light and full of shadows.
Before we dive in, check the link in the description if you want exclusive Timelines members-only videos you won't find on YouTube, all on our Patreon. The meditation chamber sealed with the sound of a tomb. Vader heard it every time, the precise hydraulic compression of the outer lock engaging, the secondary ring settling into its groove with a sound like a vertebra clicking into place. 37 distinct mechanical sounds between the moment the outer hatch accepted his command code and the moment the interior pressurized to the specifications his lungs required. He had counted them. He had counted them 1,200 times over 6 years, because there was nothing else to do inside the meditation chamber except exist. And existing required something to hold the mind in place. And his mind, the one thing Palpatine's surgeons had not been able to cut open and rewire, refused to be still. The helmet separated from the collar ring with a sound like tearing. Not lit airily. The magnetic seal released cleanly, as it always did. But there was a nerve cluster at the base of his skull, just above the third spinal interface needle, that had no proper function anymore. The scar tissue had long since rerouted the original signal pathway, and every time the helmet lifted, that cluster fired once, a phantom reflex, and what Vader felt was tearing. Had felt it 1,200 times. Would feel it again tomorrow. The helmet rose on its mount. The recycled air of the meditation chamber replaced the recycled air of the helmet's interior. And for approximately 4 seconds, before the chamber's own filtration cycle caught up, there was a fractional difference in the composition of what entered his lungs. A trace more nitrogen. A trace less of the ozone compound the suit's filtration used to compensate for his scar tissue damage in the bronchial passages. He noticed it every time. It was the closest thing to fresh air that Darth Vader, Dark Lord of the Sith, Lord of the Imperial Fleet, right hand of the Emperor, had experienced in 6 years. He sat. The meditation pod's interior was featureless, except for a curved support cradle and a low-level lighting strip that his damaged eyes could tolerate without the HUD overlay. Without the helmet, he could see the room directly, not through filtered lenses, not through the targeting reticle that the HUD imposed on every surface it detected as a potential threat, not through the motion prediction overlays that turned every moving object in his field of view into a trajectory calculation. Directly, with his own eyes. His own eyes, which were brown. He had not always remembered that. There had been a period, perhaps the 2nd and 3rd year, when he had been uncertain what color they were, because there was no surface in the Imperial world that Darth Vader occupied that contained an ordinary mirror, and the HUD's self-diagnostic view was monochromatic. He had found out again by accident. A reflection in a viewport above Coruscant's cloud layer. The light angle had been precise enough to catch his face as he removed the helmet in the chamber. Brown. Darker than they'd been in youth, or perhaps that was simply age, or the scarring on the lids, or the permanent dilation caused by years of operating in filtered light. But brown. He sat for 11 minutes without moving, which was the average time it took for the compression headache to subside after the helmet's removal. The pressure ridge the underside of the helmet left across his cranial scar tissue took 11 minutes to stop firing. Palpatine's medics had measured this, had documented it, had filed it in a report that concluded the pressure was within acceptable operational parameters. He had read that report. He had read every report generated about his own body, through 6 years of classified Imperial medical files accessed through a security clearance that even Palpatine did not know he had quietly expanded. Reading the reports was not the same as being able to act on them. But it was the beginning of a certain kind of thought. The thought had started, as most important thoughts do, with a very small detail. It had been a mission to Eriadu. A border dispute requiring his presence, his visible presence, the black armor and the breathing and the particular silence that preceded him through corridors. 2 hours of standing in a room while Imperial governors rediscovered their loyalty. Standard, unremarkable, but on the return flight, crossing through the outer atmosphere, there had been a storm system over the equatorial belt, and for 37 seconds the shuttle had passed through the edge of it, and lightning had struck the hull. Not close. Not damaging. The shuttle's shielding absorbed it without incident, but Vader had felt it. Not the lightning. The resonance of it. The way the Force conducted the electrical charge through the storm front, the way a living force sensitive could feel atmospheric bioelectricity, the way an ordinary being could feel the wind. A pressure, a texture, a direction. He had felt it move across the hull, and then, 2 seconds later, he had felt it move across him. Through the suit, through the chest plate's power converter, through the needle at the third thoracic interface point which was seated nearest to the main energy cell. A surge. Not painful, not at that scale. The storm was distant, the charge was diffuse. But enough. Enough to feel the pathway. Enough to understand, for the first time with the kind of complete physical certainty that no amount of reading medical reports could provide, what the suit had made him. A circuit. Sealed, self-contained, brilliant in its lethality. Not armor, not prosthetic. A machine into which a man had been installed and then sealed. And the sealing points had been specifically designed so that the machine would kill the man if the man attempted to exit. He had sat with that understanding for the remaining 4 hours of the return flight. He had not been angry. Anger was a young man's response to a cage. He had moved past anger years ago, into something cooler and more sustainable, a kind of absolute. Permanent attention directed at a single question. Not why. He knew why. Palpatine had explained it, not in explicit terms, but with the particular patience of a man who enjoys being understood by someone who cannot do anything about what they understand. Not why. How, inside the meditation chamber, his right hand rested on the curved support cradle. The prosthetic hand. The original post-Geonosis replacement had been installed in minutes, a field surgery, medically adequate. What replaced it after Mustafar was slower work, the same model used for clone trooper field amputations, a military-grade prosthetic designed for soldiers who needed a hand that could grip a blaster, and nothing more. The articulation range at the wrist was 63% of a biological joint's range. The lag between neural signal and physical response was 0.3 seconds. He opened the hand. He watched the fingers extend, one at a time, at the pace the joint mechanism allowed. He had made this same observation, this same deliberate, clinical observation, every day for 4 years. Not out of despair. The time for despair had come and gone without him visiting it long. He made the observation because an engineer studies the problem before proposing the solution, and whatever Palpatine had tried to make him, Anakin Skywalker had been, at 9 years old, in a slave's hovel, on a desert planet, an engineer. The third finger reached full extension 0.31 seconds after the neural command. He noted it. In his other hand, the left, the one he sometimes forgot was also prosthetic because the covering was better and the nerve mapping slightly more complete, he held a stylus. The stylus was writing on a datapad whose existence was not logged in the executor's systems. There were 3 such datapads. Their contents, if discovered, would be difficult to explain. They would be even more difficult to explain because the contents were not strategic plans or communications or anything that read as rebellion. They read as biology. Dense, precise, technical biology, annotated in a handwriting that had been deteriorating for 6 years from lack of use, and had recently, over the past 8 months, been improving again. He wrote, Third thoracic interface, current bio-neural callus formation, EST, 14 mm depth. Estimated extraction window, 6-8 months. Prerequisite, establish tissue preparation protocol before contact with Kaminoan archive. He read it back. He crossed out contact with and replaced it with acquisition of. Contact implied a relationship. This would not be a relationship. This would be a procurement, conducted at a remove, through channels that could not be traced to Mustafar, because the moment Palpatine's network associated Darth Vader with Kaminoan genetic tissue cultivation, the window would close, and the kill switch in his chest would become relevant. He set the stylus down. The compression headache had faded. What remained was the baseline, the constant that had no name in medical literature, because no medical literature had been written about a being in this specific condition. The needle at the base of his skull. The pressure at the collar ridge where the suit's torso section met the cervical armor, which did not fit perfectly, and had never fit perfectly, and would never fit perfectly, because it had been built in 17 hours by exhausted Imperial medics following instructions designed to maximize function and minimize the kind of comfort that might give the occupant of the suit. Excessive faith in his own survival. The burning sensation in both legs at mid-thigh, which was not the legs. The legs were metal. The legs felt nothing. But was the nerve terminations at the amputation sites, which had never stopped searching for the limbs that weren't there, and had therefore been searching for 6 years, and would search until something interrupted them. He breathed. In, out, the sound of the respirator filled the chamber, as it filled every room he occupied, as it had filled every room for 6 years. He had stopped hearing it the way a man stops hearing his own heartbeat. It was simply the sound of being alive, which under present circumstances was the sound of a machine, keeping a remnant functional. He picked up the stylus again. Below his first note, he wrote a single line which he had been writing at the bottom of every page of every datapad for 4 years, the way a mathematician writes a proof's target equation at the top before filling in the steps. A fixed point, a destination marked in advance, one piece at a time. He read it. Then he closed the datapad, rose from the cradle with the careful weight-distributing movement that the leg prosthetics required, and began the 37 sounds of the meditation chamber opening around him. The helmet descended to meet him. He let it. For now. Mustafar did not have seasons. What it had was variation in the intensity of its hostility, cycles of volcanic activity that geologists in the Imperial Survey Corps had spent 3 fruitless years attempting to map, before quietly recommending the planet be classified as uninhabitable and removed from the expansion registry. Vader had read their report. He had found their recommendation reasonable. He had then requisitioned the planet for personal use. The Imperial architect assigned to design his fortress had arrived with 11 assistants, a portfolio of preliminary concepts emphasizing dominance of the natural landscape, and an apparently genuine enthusiasm for the project. The man had been talented. His concepts had been interesting. Vader had looked at them for 4 minutes, handed them back and given the architect a single instruction: build it into the rock. Not on it. The architect had understood this to mean aesthetic integration with the volcanic terrain. He had produced a revised set of concepts demonstrating how the fortress's outer shell could echo the natural basalt formations, how the black durasteel could be weathered to appear continuous with the existing rock face, how from a distance the structure would seem to grow from the planet rather than be placed upon it. He had been correct in his interpretation. He had also been incomplete. What the architect had not been told, what no one had been told, was that Vader's instruction contained a second meaning, not metaphorical integration, literal concealment. Within the rock, a space that the fortress's own schematics did not fully document, accessible by a route that existed in no architectural file, reachable only by a man who had spent 14 months, over dozens of visits, walking the lower geological levels of the volcanic ridge the fortress occupied and mapping, by force sense alone, where the pressure systems created natural cavities stable enough to inhabit. He had found the chamber in the 19th month of the fortress's occupation. It was not large, 12 meters at its widest point, tapering to 6 at the far end where a geological fault in the basalt wall created a diagonal compression seam that had held against tectonic pressure for an estimated 4,000 years. The floor was uneven raw rock, cooled to a temperature Vader's temperature sensors registered as 11 degrees above what his suit's thermostat set as the lower tolerance threshold. Cold for Mustafar, which was not a planet that made a habit of cold. A natural chimney in the ceiling, 30 centimeters across, ran upward through 40 meters of rock to an exterior vent that emerged on the far side of the ridge from the fortress, invisible from above in the heat shimmer of the surrounding lava flow. The chimney vented. The chamber breathed. That had been the deciding factor. Getting to the chamber required descending to sub-level 7 of the fortress, which was documented as a geological inspection corridor, a maintenance access route for monitoring foundation stability that was inspected quarterly by 2 structural engineers who had been assigned to the fortress, had never once found anything requiring attention, and had developed, over 3 years, a thorough institutional lack of curiosity about their assignment. From there, a section of the inspection corridor's eastern wall contained a stress fracture in the durasteel paneling that had been present since installation and had been noted in 4 consecutive maintenance reports as non-structural, no action required. Behind the stress fracture, accessible only to a being with sufficient grip strength to apply lateral pressure to a specific point on the damaged panel, the wall section rotated on a pivot Vader had spent 11 evenings installing. Beyond the pivot, a hand-cut passage, 40 meters, descending at roughly 20 degrees through raw basalt. Vader had cut it himself, over the course of 3 months, using a lightsaber set to its lowest power draw and working in sessions no longer than 40 minutes to avoid heat buildup in the rock that would register on the fortress's thermal monitoring array. The passage was exactly shoulder width. It required ducking at 2 points where he had misjudged the ceiling height. He had not misjudged anything else. The chamber, when he reached it on the evening of the Eriadu mission's return, looked as he had left it 3 weeks prior. He stood at the passage entrance for a moment, letting his eyes adjust. The HUD dimmed automatically in low-light environments, shifting to thermal overlay, which turned the chamber into a landscape of heat signatures rendered in amber and deep orange, the basalt walls bleeding warmth in slow gradients. He turned the HUD off. He did this every time he entered, because the HUD's threat assessment function would otherwise spend the entire session cataloging the chamber's contents as potential objects and assigning them probability scores for hostile use, and there were only so many times he could watch the targeting system attempt a threat, assess a geology survey instrument, before the absurdity of his situation became difficult to sustain his motivation. Without the HUD, the chamber was dim and amber and real. He had furnished it with the minimum necessary for its function. A workbench, not imperial issue, not manufactured, but cut from a single slab of cooled basalt and leveled with a precision tool he had brought in segments over 4 months. On the workbench, 3 datapads, none of them logged in the executor's inventory system. A set of surgical instruments, acquired through 6 separate procurement channels spread across 2 years. Each individual tool logged as replacement medical supplies for various facilities, none of which would notice the discrepancy for at least another decade. A spectrographic analyzer, a tissue culture preparation unit, currently inactive, awaiting the biological material it would eventually process, and, in a sealed container occupying the right-hand corner of the bench, a collection of reference materials. He went to the bench. He opened the sealed container and removed the item on top, a geological survey report for the Camino system. Publicly available, scientifically unremarkable, covering oceanic depth variations and atmospheric pressure cycles across the cloning world's surface. Useless, to a geologist. To Vader, it was a different kind of document entirely, a map of cover, a scientific basis for the presence of a research requisition form that would, when submitted through the correct Imperial Science Directorate channel in approximately 4 months, request access to Kaminoan archival records on deep-sea tissue cultivation, framed as a study in pressure-adaptive biological engineering relevant to deep space crew endurance. The request would be unremarkable. The Science Directorate processed 1,100 such requests annually. Most were ignored for 6 months before a junior archivist responded with a restricted access document packet. Vader had identified the junior archivist most likely to process a request of this type, based on 18 months of studying the Directorate's internal routing patterns. He had then quietly ensured, through a series of utterly mundane budget adjustments to the Directorate's operating allocation, that this specific archivist was the one assigned to the restricted access queue. He had not spoken to the archivist. He had never been in the same star system as the archivist. The archivist did not know Vader existed. In the particular sense that no one in the Imperial bureaucracy truly processed the fact that Darth Vader existed, he was a concept, a uniform, a set of sounds, not a figure who might have opinions about archival routing procedures. That was the architecture of it. Every piece built from materials that were, individually, invisible. He set the geological survey down and picked up the primary datapad. The screen illuminated, and he stood at the workbench and read what he had written over the preceding months. It had begun as clinical notation, the kind of dispassionate problem mapping he had learned, not at the Jedi Temple, but earlier, in a desert, at a workbench not entirely unlike this one. Assembling a protocol droid from salvage components, because the solution to the problem of having nothing was to understand everything you had. The clinical notation was still there, but it had grown around it, the way growth always occurs in confined spaces, by finding the available directions and filling them. The margins of certain pages contained observations that were not medical. A note about the Ariadu lightning. A calculation about the force's relationship to bioelectric current that ran for 3 pages and concluded in a line he had underlined twice. The suit is not protection against force lightning. The suit is the mechanism of force lightning. Remove the suit, and the kill switch is removed with it. He read that line. He had read it dozens of times. It still had the same quality that important truths have, the quality of seeming obvious in retrospect, which was how you knew it was true and not merely a comfortable theory. Below the underlined line, in handwriting slightly different, steadier, he noted, than the handwriting of 8 months ago, he had written the structural breakdown. Not a plan. Not yet. A plan implied a complete timeline, a fixed sequence, a commitment to specific actions in specific order. What he had written was a taxonomy. The suit, classified by component. Each component assessed for extraction viability, prerequisite biological conditions, risk to adjacent systems during removal, estimated recovery period, and the column that had taken longest to complete, because it required a different kind of honesty than clinical notation, estimated psychological impact. He had not been certain, at first, that the last column was necessary. He had been certain for approximately 4 days before acknowledging that it was not only necessary, but probably the column that would determine whether any of the others mattered. He had written, in the estimated psychological impact column for the chest plate, unknown. No prior subject. No comparative data. This column cannot be completed in advance. He looked at that entry now. Then he took the stylus from the bench and, in the margin next to it, wrote, irrelevant. Proceed anyway. He set the stylus down and looked at the workbench in its entirety. The instruments, the culture unit, the sealed procurement chain documentation, the 14 months of accumulated technical notation, the geological survey that was not about geology. He looked at the wall above the workbench, where he had done one final thing during the chamber's preparation that was not technical and not clinical and not any kind of engineering. He had written a name, not on a data pad, on the basalt wall itself, in the same mark a lightsaber makes when set to 0 combat power and held against rock. A shallow channel, 2 centimeters deep, perfectly legible. Not Darth Vader. The other one. He looked at it for a long moment, in the amber dark, with the sound of the respirator filling the chamber and the volcanic planet breathing its slow geological breath 40 meters above him. Then he turned and began the work. The Kaminoan archive packet arrived on a Tuesday. Not that days of the week carried meaning aboard the Executor. The Star Destroyer operated on a 24-hour rotational duty cycle that acknowledged the standard galactic calendar only for the purpose of logging official communiques and filing fleet movement reports. But Vader had been tracking the expected arrival window for 11 weeks, and the day it came, he was in the middle of a tactical briefing with Admiral Ozzel, and the notification registered on the secondary data pad he kept on his person at all times. The one Ozzel believed contained real-time fleet telemetry, and he felt it the way you feel a lock turning inside a wall you have been pressing. Your weight against for months. He did not react. Ozzel continued talking about the Outer Rim patrol routes. Vader continued listening, or performing the posture of listening, which Ozzel had never once been able to distinguish from the real thing. The briefing concluded. Vader walked to his meditation chamber. He sealed it. He opened the data pad. The packet was exactly what he had engineered it to be. A restricted access scientific archive file, 43 documents, routed from the Kaminoan Biological Research Division through the Imperial Science Directorate's standard document relay. It bore the archivist's stamp. It bore no flag, no secondary review tag, no trace of anything other than bureaucratic routine. He had it fully processed and cross-referenced against his existing tissue preparation notes within 4 hours. What the Kaminoan archive contained was, to a geneticist, a collection of research abstracts on pressure-adaptive tissue cultivation used in deep-sea organism studies. What it contained to Vader was a complete cellular blueprint for growing functional lung tissue from a genetic baseline. The methodology the Kaminoans had refined across decades of cloning work, and then quietly archived when the Empire shut the facilities down, and the science became politically inconvenient. The methodology was precise. It was tested. It had been used to grow functional respiratory tissue for clone troopers requiring replacement after battlefield injuries, achieving full pulmonary integration in 83% of cases within a 14-week maturation cycle. 83%. With clone trooper baseline genetics, in a standard cloning tank, without a donor's own cellular material to guide the growth. He had his own cellular material. He had been extracting it for 6 months. The extraction process had required solving a problem that the Kaminoan archive, for all its precision, had not anticipated, obtaining viable cellular samples from tissue that existed inside a sealed life support system without triggering the suit's biological integrity monitors. The suit monitored his remaining organic tissue constantly, not out of medical care, but because Palpatine's medics needed to know if the organic components of Vader were degrading in ways that would require intervention to maintain operational capacity. Any abnormal cellular loss registered as a potential medical event and generated an automated alert to the Imperial Medical Division. He had therefore been obligated to make the extractions appear normal. He had done this by studying, over 4 months, the baseline fluctuation range of the suit's biomonitors, identifying the specific windows during sleep cycles when the monitoring sensitivity dropped to its lowest threshold, and timing each extraction to fall within those windows. Each extraction removed less than the monitoring threshold could flag. Each extraction was small enough to be indistinguishable from the ordinary cellular attrition of damaged tissue. Taken individually, invisible. Accumulated over 6 months, sufficient. The culture unit in the sanctum had been growing the first lung tissue segment for 9 weeks. He checked it every visit. It did not look like a lung. At this stage it looked like nothing in particular. A pale, slightly translucent mass the size of a closed fist, suspended in cultivation medium in a sealed chamber, no larger than a medical specimen container. It had the quality of something in the process of deciding what it was. Which was, he supposed, accurate. The first extraction of a neurointerface needle happened 6 weeks after the archive arrived. He had chosen the 4th cervical needle, not the 3rd thoracic, which was the one nearest the primary energy cell and therefore the highest risk. And not the 1st lumbar, which was the deepest seated, but the 4th cervical, which the bioneural callus scan he had conducted on himself using a modified medical scanner 3 months prior had assessed as having the shallowest integration depth of any accessible needle. 14 millimeters. The scar tissue surrounding it was older than the others, which paradoxically made it slightly less densely integrated. Old scar tissue calcified at the surface and loosened fractionally in the deeper layers. He had mapped the extraction approach 40 times on a simulation model built from his own scan data. He had designed a micro-instrument from components of the surgical set, a tool that did not exist in any medical catalog because no existing medical catalog had been written for this procedure. The instrument had a curved shaft 2 millimeters in diameter and a semi-passive vibration emitter at the tip that would create a microfracture path through the callus layer ahead of the needle's extraction path, reducing the tissue disruption from approximately the equivalent of pulling a suture through living muscle to something closer to the equivalent of removing a splinter from skin that had grown around it. He had built the instrument over 3 evenings. He had tested it on a synthetic tissue model he had grown for the purpose. Then he had taken it to the sanctum and sat at the workbench for 22 minutes without beginning. Not from doubt. He had moved past the window for doubt months ago. He sat because beginning required a very specific kind of stillness. Not the stillness of the meditation chamber, which was the stillness of suppression, of holding things down so they could not be felt, but a different kind. The stillness of a surgeon who understands that the procedure will hurt and has decided that this information is not, in the final accounting, relevant. He began. He could not see the insertion point directly. It was at the base of his skull. Above the collar line of the suit's torso section, accessible only through the narrow gap at the rear of the helmet mount. He had spent 2 months training himself to perform the approach by tactile sense alone, using the synthetic model, until his hands knew the geometry without requiring his eyes. The instrument went in at the correct angle on the first attempt. What followed was not what he had modeled. The simulation had predicted a pain response in the middle range of the suit's historical damage report spectrum, significant but manageable, the kind his body had catalogued and filed away thousands of times over 6 years, the kind that had a ceiling and a duration and an endpoint. What the simulation had not, and could not account for, was that this pain was different in character from impact pain, or pressure pain, or the burning pain of the suit's baseline existence. This was interior pain. This was the specific sensation of something that had been growing into him being unmade. The callus layer did not separate cleanly regardless of the microfracture path. It separated the way old roots separate from soil, with small catastrophic releases of tension that each felt, to the nerve cluster beneath, like a brief complete severance of signal. His vision, even through the HUD, strobed, his right hand locked for 1.4 seconds. A full neural interrupt, longer than any lag he had previously recorded, and then released. He kept the left hand still. The needle came free in the 14th minute. It was smaller than he had expected. He looked at it in the low amber light of the chamber. 11 millimeters of cortosis tipped medical-grade microneedle, tapered to a point that was now faintly stained with the bioneural compound that had been the interface between the needle and his nervous system for 6 years. At its base, a small fringe of tissue, not blood. The suit's systems had sealed the micro-wound already. The monitors would register a minor organic repair event and file it without flag. Just tissue. Just the physical record of how deeply it had been inside him. He set it on the workbench. He looked at it for a moment. He wrote in the datapad, 4th cervical needle extracted. Procedure duration, 14 minutes. Neural interrupt, 1.4 seconds right hand. Pain classification, interior release, no monitor flag. Tissue sample retained for analysis. Recovery observation period, begin now. He sat in the chamber for 2 more hours, monitoring the nerve cluster's response. The signal did not reroute within the observation window. It would take days, perhaps a week, for the surrounding tissue to begin compensating. During that period, the 4th cervical nerve cluster would be hypersensitive and somewhat unpredictable, a small region of static in the back of his skull. He noted the expected recovery timeline. He noted the next candidate needle. He noted the minimum waiting period before proceeding, 6 weeks, based on the Kamino and tissue recovery data applied to his specific nerve density readings. Then he looked at the culture unit. The lung tissue had grown. He had not checked it since the previous visit, 8 days prior. In 8 days it had added approximately a centimeter of lateral growth, and the translucency had shifted. It was slightly more opaque at the center, which the Kaminoan cultivation notes indicated, was the stage at which cellular differentiation was beginning, when the tissue started committing to specific structural identities rather than remaining pluripotent. It was deciding what it was. He looked at it for a long time. The respirator filled the chamber with its rhythm. In, mechanical pause. Out, mechanical pause. The sound that had been the sound of his existence for 6 years. The sound that meant he was alive in the particular way Palpatine had chosen for him to be alive. He placed one hand against the exterior of the culture chamber. The material was cool. Through the suit's tactile sensors, which were not fine enough to distinguish texture, but could register temperature and basic pressure, he felt the smoothness of it. Inside, 9 weeks and 6 months of work, and before that 14 months of planning, and before that the moment above Ariadu when lightning had moved through him, and he had understood what he was. The needle was on the workbench. The tissue was growing. He breathed. In, out for the first time in 6 years. The sound of his breathing was not the only thing in the room. Beneath it, faint, organic, entirely his own, the tissue in the culture chamber was alive. The 7th sister arrived on Mustafar without announcing herself. This was, Vader understood, intentional. The Inquisitorius had been trained in the particular psychology of surprise entry. The belief that catching a subject in an unguarded moment produced more useful information than any formal interview could generate. It was a competent technique. It worked reliably on subjects who had unguarded moments. He felt her ship enter the upper atmosphere 40 minutes before it landed. Not through the fortress's sensor array. though the array registered her too. And the duty officer logged her arrival with the specific brand of nervous efficiency that characterized everyone assigned to Mustafar Station when unexpected visitors appeared. He felt her through the force, the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm front arrives, not the storm itself, but the displacement it creates ahead of itself. The way the atmosphere moves to accommodate something coming. He had been in the sanctum. He had 40 minutes. He used 32 of them to complete what he was doing, which was the 8th needle extraction, the second lumbar this time. A more complex approach than the cervical series had been, requiring a contortion of the left arm that the prosthetic joint handled poorly, and that he had spent 3 weeks practicing on the synthetic model until the approach angle was automatic. The needle came free in 19 minutes. The pain was different from the cervical extractions. Lower, broader, a pressure release rather than a signal interrupt, like a knot in deep muscle finally unknotting, except the muscle was nerve tissue, and the unknotting left a temporary numbness across the left side of his lower back that he had anticipated and documented in advance. He sealed the culture unit. He closed the data pads. He returned the instruments to their case and the case to its position beneath the workbench's basalt overhang. He walked the 40 meters of passage and reset the wall panel. He was in the geological inspection corridor, moving toward the lift, when the fortress's internal comm registered her landing. He arrived at the upper receiving level 3 minutes before she did. The seventh sister moved through the fortress like someone conducting an inspection she had already decided to fail. She was precise in her observations and generous with her silences, the calculated silences of someone who understood that silence, in an interrogation, did most of the work. She had dark eyes and a manner that in another context might have read as academic. In this context it read as predatory. She stopped in the central corridor of the fortress's main level and waited for him to come to her, which he found interesting. Every other visitor to Mustafar, every admiral, every imperial official, every courier, walked toward Vader. The seventh sister had positioned herself and waited, which meant either she was genuinely unafraid or she was performing genuine unafraid very well. He walked toward her at his standard pace, not slower, not faster. "Lord Vader," she said. Her voice carried the particular warmth of someone who had learned warmth as a technique. "The Emperor sends his regards." "The Emperor," Vader said, "sends you." She smiled. It was a good smile, practiced without appearing practiced, which required more skill than most people understood. "He has concerns about your isolation here. He feels you may benefit from additional resources." "Support, support," he repeated. "The Inquisitorius is at your disposal. We have considerable expertise in, I am aware of what the Inquisitorius does." She accepted this without reaction, which was the correct response, and told him she was more capable than her opening had suggested. The opening had been a test. She had read his response correctly and adjusted. He also, she said, her tone shifting minimally, just enough to signal that the social portion of the conversation was concluding, wishes to understand the nature of the work you conduct here. The fortress's resource requisitions over the past 22 months have been somewhat, she paused, and the pause was not accidental, diverse. There it was. He had known this conversation was coming. He had known it with the same certainty with which he knew the needle series would eventually cause a monitoring flag, or that the Science Directorate packet would eventually pass through a secondary analyst with more curiosity than the first. The architecture of a long operation was that each component was individually invisible and cumulatively, at a certain scale, began to have a shape. Palpatine was the most patient being he had encountered in 2 decades of service. Palpatine had been watching the shape. He had prepared for this conversation with the same methodology he applied to everything else. Not a script. Scripts failed under pressure when the other party deviated. A set of true statements, carefully selected, arranged to produce a complete and accurate picture of something other than what was actually happening. "Walk with me," he said. He took her to the fortress's upper observatory level, a circular room near the highest point of the structure, with a full viewport looking out over the volcanic plain. At night, which it currently was, the plain was lit from below by the lava flows, a deep amber light that moved in slow geological rhythms. It was, he had found, an effective room for conversations that required the other party to feel simultaneously impressed and slightly destabilized by their environment. He stood at the viewport and let her look. "The requisitions," he said, "reflect research I am conducting into force-enhanced interrogation methodology. Specifically, the physiological limits of subjects under sustained force pressure, the point at which the body's stress response interferes with accurate information extraction." This was true. He had conducted exactly this research. It was documented, rigorously, in 2 data pads that were logged in the Fortress's official research files and available for review. The research was real. The research was also entirely secondary to his actual work, and had been designed from the beginning as the visible layer, the thing that explained the biology instruments, the tissue culture equipment, the medical supply requisitions, all of it reframed as tools of an interrogation study rather than tools of a personal reconstruction. The seventh sister looked at the viewport. Then she looked at him. "Physiological limits," she said. "That accounts for the medical instruments. The tissue culture unit in sub-level 4's equipment inventory. That accounts for the sample preservation. The geological survey materials. Environmental factors in force sensitivity response," he said. "Mustafar's geomagnetic field has measurable effects on force perception thresholds. I am mapping them." She was quiet for 4 seconds. He counted. "Lord Vader," she said finally, "I have been doing this work for 9 years. Investigating, assessing, I am very good at knowing when an explanation is complete. And? Your explanation is complete," she said. "That is what concerns me." He turned from the viewport to look at her directly. She held his gaze, which most people could not do for more than a few seconds. The helmet, the breathing, the particular quality of attention he directed at a person when he was genuinely assessing them. She held it for a full 7 seconds before her eyes moved slightly left. 7 seconds was exceptional. "You were sent here to find something," he said. "You will return to the Emperor and report that you found a research program consistent with its documentation, a fortress operating within standard parameters, and a Lord of the Sith who does not require support or resources from the Inquisitorius. And if the Emperor asks what I found specifically, tell him you found me working," Vader said. "That is what I am always doing." She spent 6 hours in the fortress. He knew where she was at every moment, not through surveillance, though the fortress had surveillance, but through force sense, tracking her presence the way you track a stone dropped in still water, by the ripples. She was methodical. She checked the documented research files, which were thorough and genuine. She examined the equipment manifest, which matched the research documentation precisely. She walked sub-level 4 and looked at the tissue culture unit and its logged contents, which were what they were logged as being. She did not find sub-level 7, not because she was not looking. She looked at walls the way someone looks at walls when they are looking for what is behind them, with a slight excess of attention, a fractional pause before moving on. She paused at the correct section of the inspection corridor for 11 seconds. The stress fracture in the paneling was there. It was always there. It had been in 4 maintenance reports. 11 seconds was long enough to notice it. She moved on. In the observatory. Later, she sat across from him and they had a second conversation that was not about the research program. She talked about the Inquisitorius, about the current campaign against surviving Jedi in the Outer Rim, about a particular target who had evaded 3 pursuit operations, and whose force signature suggested training from the Old Order's senior tier. She was asking, in the framing of a briefing, whether he wished to take the assignment personally. He recognized this too. A gift. An offering of relevance, the implication that his isolation here had removed him from meaningful work, and she was providing a bridge back. "No," he said. She accepted this without argument, which was the moment he decided she was genuinely intelligent rather than merely skilled. When her ship lifted from the landing platform and climbed through Mustafar's ash cloud into the upper atmosphere, he tracked it until it cleared the gravity well and jumped to hyperspace. Then he returned to his meditation chamber and sat and ran a complete internal assessment of the conversation. Every exchange, every pause, every moment where her eyes had moved. There was one moment. Not the corridor. Earlier, in the observatory, when he had listed the 3 things she would report to the Emperor. She had not reacted. But her breathing had changed, fractionally a slight shallowing, the kind that happened when a person heard something true that they had not expected to be told directly. She had known he was managing her. He had known, she knew. She had chosen, in full awareness, to accept the management. He noted this in the datapad, not as a threat, as a variable. Then, he noted the recovery status of the second lumbar nerve cluster, confirmed the next extraction window, and recorded that the lung tissue had reached the differentiation threshold on schedule. The seventh sister would report to Palpatine. Palpatine would receive a complete, accurate account of a research program that explained everything she had found. He would continue. The Beskar arrived in 3 separate shipments across 4 months, not as Beskar. The manifests read as Durasteel alloy components for fortress maintenance infrastructure, support struts, load-bearing brackets, conduit housing. Standard materials for a structure built into active volcanic rock, which required regular replacement of load-bearing elements as thermal expansion stressed the joints. The duty quartermaster on Mustafar Station had processed 47 similar requisitions over 3 years, and had developed, as intended, a complete absence of curiosity about them. The actual Durasteel components were delivered and installed, because they were real requisitions for real maintenance needs that Vader had identified 18 months in advance, and scheduled deliberately to coincide with the Beskar shipments. The fortress's infrastructure genuinely improved. The quartermaster's records were accurate. The Beskar, comprising roughly 12% of the total delivered material weight across the 3 shipments, was separated from the legitimate components in the fortress's lower receiving bay during the single 4-hour window each month, when Vader conducted what the duty roster logged as personal inspection of incoming materials. He had been sourcing it for 2 years before the first shipment arrived. Mandalorian Beskar in post-Imperial consolidation space was not difficult to find. It was difficult to find without leaving a trace that pointed toward a buyer with specific intentions. The difficulty was not acquisition, it was provenance laundering. The systematic disconnection of the material from any chain of documentation that could be reconstructed, to explain why the Dark Lord of the Sith required 63 kilograms of the galaxy's most force-resistant alloy in precise anatomical dimensions. He had solved this by purchasing it as 17 different materials from 9 different sources across 6 systems. With the Imperial Purchasing Authority distributed through 4 separate procurement divisions whose budgetary jurisdictions did not overlap, and whose internal audits were conducted on non-concurrent cycles. By the time the 3rd shipment arrived, the Beskar existed, in official records, as 42 distinct line items in 4 divisional budgets, none of which individually constituted a notable expenditure, and none of which would ever be cross-referenced, because cross-referencing them would require a being who simultaneously had access to 4 separate divisional audit systems and a reason to suspect they were connected. Palpatine had such access. Palpatine had such access to everything, which was why the operation had required 2 years of acquisition preparation rather than 2 months. The forge was the simplest component of the sanctum to establish, and the most technically demanding to operate. Mustafar had one resource in abundance. He had simply required a method of directing it. The geological fault at the far end of the sanctum had a hairline thermal fissure running along its base, a microchannel through which superheated gas vented at irregular intervals, temperature variable between 800 and 1400 degrees Celsius, depending on the volcanic activity cycle. For most purposes, this was an environmental hazard. For the purpose of working Beskar, which required sustained temperatures above 1100 degrees for primary shaping and precise controlled cooling for tempering, it was, after 18 months of geological monitoring and 2 months of careful modification, a forge. The modification had required installing a regulation valve in the fissure channel, a ceramic insert machined to a tolerance of 0.2 millimeters that allowed him to restrict or open the gas flow and thereby control the forge temperature within a workable range. He had machined the ceramic insert himself, in the sanctum, using a precision lathe he had assembled from components, the components logged, individually, as replacement parts for the fortress's environmental monitoring equipment. The forge occupied the far third of the sanctum. When active, the ambient temperature in the chamber climbed to levels that the suit's thermostat worked steadily to compensate for. He sweated inside the suit when the forge was running, or whatever approximation of sweating the damaged tissue across his torso managed, and the suit's moisture management system processed it without flagging. Because heavy thermal environments were an operational expectation on Mustafar, he had made the first Beskar component 11 months ago, a test piece, a simple flat plate, worked and reworked to calibrate his technique. He had never forged Beskar before. He had read everything available on the subject, Mandalorian metallurgical texts, Imperial material science surveys that had studied, captured Beskar samples, 2 classified weapons research reports from the Imperial Advanced Weapons Division that had concluded Beskar was too labor-intensive for mass production and recommended no further investment. The test piece had taken 6 sessions to produce to the standard he required. The 6th attempt had been correct. He had kept it on the workbench as a reference. The prosthetic limb system he was building was not a replacement in the standard medical sense. A standard prosthetic replacement was designed around the concept of restoration, recreating the biological function that had been lost, approximating the original as closely as technology allowed. He was not approximating anything that had existed before. What he was building was something that had never existed. The design had evolved across 14 months of iteration, starting from the Imperial military-grade prosthetic specifications he had memorized years ago, and moving systematically away from every constraint those specifications had imposed. The military design prioritized durability over articulation, weight tolerance over precision, standardized production over individual calibration. He had inverted every priority. The core structural framework was Beskar, not solid, which would have produced limbs too heavy for even his force-augmented strength to move at combat speed, but a lattice structure, 3-dimensional mesh of Beskar struts in a geometry he had calculated to distribute stress loads across the maximum number of contact points, while leaving the interior volume available for the neural mapping systems. The lattice weighed 2.1 kilograms per arm and 4.7 kilograms per leg. Against the original prosthetics 4.2 and 9.1 kilograms respectively, the reduction was significant. Against biological baseline, the arms were still heavy. The legs were nearly comparable. The neural interface layer was the component that had required the most development time. Standard prosthetics used passive signal relay connectors, blunt instruments that transmitted a general command signal and left the limb's internal mechanics to interpret it. The result was the 0.3-second lag that had defined his combat capability for 6 years. He had replaced the passive relay with an active mapping array, a system of 240 microsensors distributed through the Beskar lattice, each calibrated to the specific neural pathway pattern of his surviving nerve terminations at each amputation site. The calibration had required mapping those nerve patterns in precise detail, which had required a scanning procedure he had conducted on himself over 3 sessions using a modified neurological assessment tool, and which had produced a complete neural topography of each amputation site that he was fairly certain was more detailed than anything in the Imperial Medical Division's files on his physiology. The lag when he ran simulations on the completed arm designs was 0.04 seconds, not 0. Nothing biological was 0. But 0.04 seconds was within the range of biological neural transmission delay, the natural latency of a signal traveling from the brain to the hand through nerve tissue. It was not a prosthetic response, it was an organic response, in an inorganic system. He installed the right arm first. The installation was the part of the process that could not be simulated, because the critical variable, the interface between the Beskar lattice's neural mapping array and his actual nerve terminations, could only be calibrated with the limb physically connected. The physical connection was surgical. The surgery was performed in the sanctum, by himself, with the mirror surface of a polished Beskar plate, positioned to give him a sight line to the amputation site. He had rehearsed the surgical sequence 230 times on the synthetic model. The old prosthetic came off in 6 minutes. The amputation site beneath it was what it was. Scar tissue and nerve termination clusters, and 6 years of biological adaptation to an interface that had never been designed with adaptation in mind. He did not look at it longer than the surgical assessment required. The new limb seated at the connection housing with a resistance fit. No bolts, no external fasteners. The Beskar housing machined to a tolerance that created a mechanical bond through pressure and the shape of the joint geometry alone. The primary neural interface engaged in the first 4 seconds, the mapping array beginning its calibration sweep through the nerve terminations. What he had not fully modeled was the calibration's sensory quality. The passive relay of the original prosthetic had been, always, a blunt instrument in both directions. It transmitted his commands outward with limited precision, and it transmitted sensory feedback inward with even more limited precision. He could feel pressure through the original hand. He could feel temperature in a binary sense. Hot, not hot. He could not feel texture. He could not feel the difference between silk and stone. The mapping array's calibration sweep was active. It sent a low-level signal through each of the 240 sensor positions to locate and confirm the corresponding nerve termination, and each confirmation returned sensory data at the full resolution the nerve termination was capable of. His right hand was resting against the basalt surface of the workbench during the calibration. He felt the basalt. Not pressure, not temperature. The texture of it, the granular quality of cooled volcanic rock, the slight irregularity of the surface, the way the edges of the individual mineral crystals registered as a landscape of microsensation across his palm and fingertips. He sat completely still for 40 seconds. Then he lifted the hand and pressed it flat against the cool exterior of the culture unit. The lung tissue inside had grown to the size of both fists together now. The differentiation was nearly complete. The Kaminoan cultivation notes put full structural maturity at 3 weeks out. Through the culture unit's smooth casing, his new hand told him the temperature differential between the heated cultivation medium and the ambient air of the sanctum, told him the faint vibration of the unit's circulation pump, told him the precise geometry of the surface curvature beneath his palm. He held it there. In the datapad, later he wrote, "Right arm installation complete. Calibration time, 23 minutes. Neural lag measured at 0.038 seconds. Within target parameters. Sensory resolution. Full tactile spectrum confirmed." Psychological impact. He stopped. He held the stylus above the page for a moment. Then he wrote, in the psychological impact column, "The only honest thing. Unexpected. Reassess prior assumption that this column is irrelevant." He flexed the hand once, slowly, watching each finger reach full extension. No lag he could perceive. He picked up the stylus again and wrote, below everything else, in the same place he always wrote it, one piece at a time. Then he began the preparation for the left. The storm came in from the eastern vent field 3 hours before he was ready for it. Mustafar's electrical storms were not weather in the conventional sense. They did not build gradually from pressure differentials or moisture accumulation the way storms did on planets with atmospheres that behaved themselves. They erupted. Volcanic gas meeting the upper ionosphere, superheated particulate matter, creating charge differentials that discharged in patterns that the Imperial Survey Corps had classified as non-predictive, before abandoning the attempt entirely. A storm could go from clear sky to full electrical activity in 11 minutes. It could last 4 hours, or 4 days. It could move laterally across the plane at 60 kilometers per hour, or sit directly overhead, without shifting for a week. He had been monitoring this particular storm system for 9 days. Not because he needed to monitor it. The fortress's meteorological array tracked all volcanic weather activity within a 200-kilometer radius and updated every 6 minutes. He had been monitoring it because he had been waiting for it to reach the correct position, directly over the eastern ridge, which was the ridge his sanctum's chimney vented through, which meant the electrical discharge would be concentrated in the geological formation directly above where he intended to stand. He had been waiting for a storm of sufficient magnitude for 4 months. The energy absorption matrix was the component he had been least certain about, not in its design. The design was clean, derived from Imperial Shield technology research he had accessed through a weapons development clearance he had held for 11 years, and never previously used for this purpose, but in its integration. The matrix was embedded in the new chest framework he had installed 6 weeks prior, replacing the original suit's power converter architecture with a system that served the same function, routing power to the life support systems, but added a secondary pathway. The secondary pathway was the point. The original chest plate's power architecture was a single-loop system. Power cell to life support systems, no redundancy, no protection against power surges, no shielding against externally introduced electrical current. This was the mechanism by which force lightning became lethal. The current entered the suit at any conductive point, hit the power architecture, and was routed through every system simultaneously, every needle interface, every life support node, every sensor array, in a feedback surge that the biological components could not survive. The Matrix added a parallel pathway, not a redirect. A redirect would absorb some current and leave the rest to continue into the primary loop, which was insufficient. A parallel pathway that, under surge conditions, became the path of least resistance. Current-seeking ground would find the Matrix before it found the life support grid. The Matrix would absorb the surge, convert it to heat, and dissipate it through the outer armor panels as thermal radiation. The physics were correct. The materials were correct. The integration was correct, as far as integration on a bench in a volcanic cave could be assessed as correct. What he did not know, and could not know without a test at scale, was whether the Matrix's response time was fast enough. Force lightning was not a standard electrical current. It was bioelectricity amplified through the force. It moved faster than a standard electrical discharge, and it carried, beneath the raw current, a force signature that interacted with the biology of the target in ways that pure physics did not fully model. The Matrix was designed for the electrical component. Whether it would respond quickly enough and completely enough to protect against the force signature component was a question that could only be answered by standing in the storm. He had considered designing a remote test, a surrogate system, a shielded mock-up he could expose to lightning while monitoring from a distance. He had rejected it. A surrogate system was not his body. The Matrix's integration with his specific physiological architecture, the particular way his neural interfaces would respond to a surge event, the interaction between the force signature component and his own force sensitivity, none of this could be modeled by a surrogate. The only valid test was the test. He had simply needed to wait for the right storm. He reached the ridge's exterior at 0200 hours station time. The path from the fortress to the ridge's outer face was not a path in any documented sense. It was a route he had identified by walking the terrain for 6 months, a series of stable basalt outcroppings that formed a traversable line through the active lava field on the fortress's eastern side. At night, with the lava flows providing ambient illumination, the route was visible, without the HUD. He had walked it in HUD-off mode 12 times to ensure he could navigate it under any conditions. He turned the HUD off now. The storm was directly overhead. He could feel it before he could see it clearly. The pressure of the electrical charge built up in the cloud layer above the ridge, manifesting as a force sensation he could only describe as texture. The atmosphere itself having acquired a quality, a resistance, like walking through air that had become aware of him. Lightning struck the ridge's peak 3 times in the 4 minutes it took him to reach his position, a flat outcropping on the ridge's eastern face, exposed on 3 sides. At the apex of the highest conductive point in the local terrain. He stood on the outcropping and waited. The storm was not impressive in the way that storms on living planets were impressive. It did not have the slow grandeur of a weather system, the building pressure, the smell of rain. It was immediate and industrial and indifferent. The sky above the ridge was a continuous flicker, discharge after discharge in channels that lasted less than a second and left afterimages on the back of the eye. The sound was not thunder. It was a sustained crackling. A sound like a star destroyer's hull plates under stress, present everywhere at once, with no directional source. The first strike hit him at 0214 hours. It entered through the left pauldron, which was the highest conductive point of his current profile. The Beskar lattice of the left arm and shoulder assembly extending slightly above the torso line, a geometry he had chosen deliberately because he needed the strike point to be at the maximum distance from the chest matrix, to fully test the matrix's conduction speed across the entire system. What happened in the next 0.3 seconds was the test. In the original architecture, this would have been the beginning of the end. The current would have entered the pauldron, traveled through the armor conduction path to the chest plate's power converter, hit the life support grid, and detonated every interface in his body simultaneously. He felt the strike enter the left shoulder. He felt it travel, not as pain, as presence, as a force signature moving through his system the way a ripple moves through still water, touching every interface it passed. He felt it reach the matrix. The matrix took it. Not instantaneously, there was a moment, a fraction of a moment, that was long enough to be aware of. in which the current was simultaneously in his system and being absorbed. A moment of overlap in which he felt the force signature of the lightning interact with his own force sense, and he understood, completely and finally, what Palpatine had built into him. Not just the electrical kill switch. The force signature of the lightning carried, at its core, something he had not detected in the theoretical analysis, because you could not detect it theoretically. It carried intent. Palpatine's force signature, pressed into the lightning technique across decades of use, carried in the discharge itself a kind of claim, a resonance that said mine in the language of the Force. That said I made you, I own you, I end you in a frequency that was not sound and not sensation but was somehow both. The matrix absorbed the electrical component. The force signature did not dissipate. It reached his nervous system and found nothing to claim. No needle interfaces routing power through damaged tissue. No life support grid converting the current to catastrophic feedback. No architecture designed to amplify an exterior signal into internal destruction. The force signature of the lightning moved through him and encountered a body that was, piece by piece, no longer the body Palpatine had designed it to destroy. It passed through. The heat from the Matrix's dissipation vented through the outer armor panels along his back. He felt it as warmth, a spreading warmth across his shoulder blades, the Beskar conducting and releasing. The storm struck him twice more in the next 4 minutes. The second strike was heavier than the first. The third was the heaviest contact he had experienced, a direct hit to the crown of the helmet that would, in the original suit, have ended the conversation about Force lightning permanently. He stood in it. He stood in it and felt the warmth across his back, and the force signature of Palpatine's technique passing through him like wind through an open doorway, finding no purchase, claiming nothing, dissipating into the volcanic air of a planet that did not care about the Emperor's intentions. He stood there for another 20 minutes after the third strike, not because further testing was required. The Matrix had performed beyond its design parameters. The force signature interaction had answered every question his theoretical analysis had left open. But because he was not ready to move yet. The storm continued. Lightning struck the ridge around him, struck him twice more at reduced intensity, struck the basalt outcroppings to his left and right. He stood at the center of it without the HUD, without the targeting overlays, with his new hands at his sides, and the warmth of dissipated lightning moving slowly across the armor panels on his back. He thought about Palpatine, sitting in his office above Coruscant, believing that the man standing in this storm was still the machine he had built, still sealed inside the kill switch, still walking around in the coffin. He noted the time in the datapad when he returned to the sanctum, Oro 247 hours. He wrote one line, Matrix integration confirmed. Force signature component, non-lethal under current physiological architecture. Test result. Conclusive. He looked at it. Then he wrote below it, in the margin, not in the clinical notation he used for everything else, but in the handwriting he used for one other purpose. The handwriting he used when he wrote the name on the wall. He built a detonator inside me. It no longer detonates. He set the stylus down. Outside, the storm continued. He let it. The performance began as all performances do, with deciding what the audience needed to believe. Palpatine's surveillance of Mustafar had 3 layers, which Vader had mapped across 4 years of careful observation. The first layer was technical, sensor arrays, communication monitoring. The quarterly structural engineering inspections that were not entirely about structural engineering. The second layer was human, the fortress staff, none of whom had been assigned to Mustafar by accident, all of whom filed reports through channels they believed were confidential and that Vader had been reading for 3 years. The third layer was the Force, Palpatine's periodic, careful extensions of perception toward his apprentice, probes so subtle that a less experienced Force user would never have detected them. Vader had detected the first one in the 18th month of the fortress's occupation. He had spent 2 weeks doing nothing in response, simply noting its texture. The specific quality of Palpatine's Force signature when it reached across space in observation mode rather than communication mode. There was a difference. Communication mode carried intent, direction, the Force equivalent of someone turning toward you and speaking. Observation mode was quieter, a peripheral presence, the Force equivalent of someone watching from a doorway. He had learned to feel the doorway. The surveillance architecture told him what the performance required. The technical layer needed to see medical support equipment consistent with the suit's ongoing maintenance, the kind of gradual degradation and repair cycle that characterized a life support system of this age and complexity. The human layer needed to observe behavior consistent with an isolated Sith Lord conducting research and managing the Eastern Fleet, functional, controlled, occasionally volatile in ways that confirmed their reports to their handlers. The Force layer needed to feel a dark side presence, powerful and contained, with the specific texture that 6 years of living in the suit had given his Force signature, the layered quality of pain converted to power, of limitation expressed as anger. None of these requirements were difficult to satisfy individually. The challenge was satisfying all three simultaneously while the body beneath the performance was changing. He had solved it through what the theatrical tradition of a dozen civilizations would have called method acting, though he had not named it that, because naming things was sometimes a way of making them smaller than they were. The suit still went on every morning. This was not a concession to the surveillance. It was a medical requirement that would remain a medical requirement until the lung tissue was ready for transplantation, which the culture unit's current development stage placed at 11 weeks out. His lungs could not process unfiltered atmosphere. The helmet's filtration remained essential. The chest plate's life support architecture remained essential. The neuro-interface needles, 12 of the original 26 remained, all in the spinal column's thoracic section. The region he had determined required the most careful sequential extraction to avoid spinal nerve disruption, remained essential. What had changed was what was underneath the suit. The arms were new, beneath the original suit's arm casings. He wore the old casings over the Beskar lattice. The external profile was identical. The suit's diagnostic systems registered the prosthetic connections as the expected model, because he had spent 3 weeks building interface bridges between the new neural mapping array and the suit's diagnostic readout system. Translating the new system's output into a signal format the old diagnostic expected to see. The suit read his new arms as the old arms. The legs had been completed 6 weeks ago, the same process, the same Beskar lattice under the original casings. The suit read his new legs as the old legs. The chest matrix was the most delicate deception, because the chest plate's power converter interfaced directly with the suit's central diagnostic hub, and replacing the power architecture had required maintaining the exact same power draw profile, the same voltage, the same current patterns, the same timing signatures, while routing through a fundamentally different internal structure. He had spent 11 weeks building the translation layer that made the new matrix perform, to the diagnostic hub, identically to the original converter. The suit read his new chest as the old chest. He wore the suit, and the suit did not know what was inside it. The performance's most demanding element was the pain. Not the real pain. The real pain was present. Ongoing. The baseline of the remaining 12 needles and the suit's pressure and the helmet's compression headache, all of it as available as it had always been. The demanding element was the performed pain. The performance Palpatine's Force probe needed to observe when it reached the doorway and looked in. The texture of Vader's Force presence had been shaped, across 6 years, by the specific quality of his physical experience. Pain converted to power had a particular signature, a density, a compression, a quality of something under enormous pressure that had resolved its relationship with that pressure into pure function. It was recognizable. Palpatine had felt it thousands of times. He expected to feel it. The complication was that as the suit's architecture changed, as the needles came out and the new limbs went in, the physical experience that had generated that texture was changing. The pain was diminishing. Not completely. The 12 remaining thoracic needles were not subtle, and the helmet's compression and the suit's baseline cruelty remained entirely intact, but diminishing. And diminishing pain, if he allowed it to simply diminish, would create a change in his Force signature that a being of Palpatine's sensitivity would eventually detect. He could not let the texture change. So he maintained it deliberately. Not through seeking additional suffering. That approach was both inefficient and philosophically uninteresting. He maintained it through a Force discipline technique that he had developed across 4 years of practice that had no name in any tradition he knew, and that functioned by directing his force awareness inward to the remaining pain sources and amplifying their signal, not the pain itself, but his perception of it, the force-active layer of sensation that constituted the dark side fuel he had been running on since Mustafar. He took what remained of the physical experience and used the force to make it present at the volume it had always occupied. From the outside, felt by a force probe at the doorway, it was identical. From the inside, it required sustained attention, the same kind of attention a musician required to hold a note precisely in tune while playing other things around it. A continuous background process, running beneath every other function, maintaining the signature. He had been running this process for 16 months. The performance had its demands on the human surveillance layer as well. Commander Voss, his senior aide on Mustafar Station, was the most capable of the staff Palpatine had positioned in the fortress. Not the most senior. That was the station's administrative director, a bureaucratic placeholder whose reports were reliably useless. Voss was the one who noticed things. He was approximately 40 years old, former Imperial intelligence, reassigned to Mustafar in circumstances that Vader had investigated and found genuine. A political misstep on Coruscant that had resulted in a lateral posting that Voss considered a career death sentence, and that he was therefore motivated to escape by producing reports of value. Voss reported on Vader's behavior, movement patterns, apparent physical condition and observable research activities. He was observant enough to notice changes in gait. Vader had therefore calibrated the new legs to reproduce the original prosthetics movement profile exactly, including the slight asymmetry in the right leg stride pattern, caused by a joint calibration issue in the original that had never been corrected. He was observant enough to notice changes in the suit's sound profile. Vader had therefore kept the original casing's servo systems active. So the sound of the suit's movement remained identical. What Voss could not observe was the force required to move through the fortress each day. The original prosthetics had required force augmentation to move at combat speed. The weight and lag made natural movement at the pace Vader's duties required into a constant low-level effort. A steady draw on force energy, just to walk down a corridor at the pace of a man in command of his own body. The new limbs required no augmentation for ordinary movement. They responded to his neural signals at 0.038 seconds and bore their own weight without assistance. He augmented them anyway. Every step through the fortress, he applied the same force draw the old limbs had required. Not because the new limbs needed it, but because the force usage pattern was part of the texture Palpatine's probe expected to find. A sudden reduction in the low-level force effort required for basic movement would be, to a sufficiently sensitive observer, a change in the landscape. He maintained the landscape. The effort required to perform the suit's weakness while not being weak was, he had found, considerably more demanding than the suit's weakness itself had ever been. The suit had been a cage. The performance of the cage, from the inside of a body that was no longer caged, required a precision and a sustained attention that the cage itself had never demanded. He found this, in the way that he had found certain things across his life, the pod race's specific calculations. The engineering problems of his childhood, the lightsaber forms that required years of refinement, genuinely interesting. Not pleasant. Interesting, the problem had a shape. Working within the shape's constraints produced a kind of satisfaction that he had not expected to recover the capacity for. He noted this in the datapad, not in the clinical notation column. In the margin. At 0340 hours on the 47th day of the performance's most demanding phase, the phase during which the chest matrix was fully installed but the thoracic needles remained, the phase requiring the force amplification technique and the movement calibration and the diagnostic deception all simultaneously, he felt the doorway. Palpatine's probe, quiet, peripheral, reaching across the distance between Coruscant and Mustafar, with the patience of a being who had been doing this for decades and had never yet found anything other than what he expected. Vader held still inside the meditation chamber and maintained the texture. Pain converted to power. Limitation expressed as anger. The signature of a broken thing that had made itself functional through will alone. The probe reached the doorway, looked in, felt what it expected. Withdrew. He sat for 6 minutes afterward without moving. Not from recovery. The technique had not been taxing. He had been running it continuously for 16 months. but because there was something in the moment of Palpatine's probe finding exactly what it expected that required a moment of acknowledgement. The Emperor had looked directly at him, had seen nothing. He reached for the datapad. He wrote the time, the duration of the probe contact, and its outcome. No anomaly detected. Performance holding. Then he sat in the dark and breathed through the helmet and thought about the culture unit in the sanctum, 11 weeks from maturity, growing in the dark below him, deciding what it was. One piece at a time. Commander Sayla Dane had never met Darth Vader. She had, in her 11 years of work, 4 in Imperial intelligence, 7 building and running a rebel cell that had survived longer than any comparable operation in the Outer Rim, developed a comprehensive professional opinion about him. The opinion was that he was the single most dangerous instrument of the Empire's will, that direct engagement with him was categorically unsurvivable, and that any operational plan requiring proximity to him should be discarded before it was fully articulated. She had communicated this opinion to 3 different Rebel Alliance command structures over 7 years, and had been told, in varying degrees of diplomatic phrasing, that she was correct. She would have been disturbed to know that Darth Vader had, over the preceding 8 months, spent a combined total of approximately 40 hours thinking about her. Not about her specifically, about her cell, its composition, its operational history, its current intelligence-gathering activities around the Quat Drive yards, and the specific nature of the threat it posed to an operation she was entirely unaware of. The Quat problem had presented itself 14 months ago, when Vader's procurement routing for the Beskar's 3rd shipment had required passing a documentation chain through a subsidiary of Quat Engineering Services, a manufacturing conglomerate with extensive Imperial contracts, and as Vader had discovered through 11 months of patient intelligence analysis, an equally extensive and carefully concealed relationship with a rebel intelligence network that used the conglomerate's shipping manifests as a document laundering substrate. Dane's cell was the network. Her analysts were, he had determined, competent enough to eventually identify the anomaly in the Kess shipping manifests, not what it meant, not what the materials were, or where they were going, but the fact of the anomaly itself, the pattern break in the documentation that indicated something was being moved through the legitimate manifest stream. In standard operational practice, the response to this threat was simple: locate the cell, destroy it, close the intelligence leak. He had the resources to accomplish this within 72 hours of making the decision. He had not made the decision. The alternative had taken 6 weeks to architect. The principle was one Palpatine had demonstrated to him repeatedly across 2 decades of service, though never with the specific application Vader was now making of it. The principle was that a known intelligence asset was more valuable than an eliminated one, because a known asset could be directed, not controlled. Control required the asset's knowledge of the relationship, which introduced variables that degraded the asset's utility. But directed. The way you direct water, not by stopping it, but by shaping the terrain through which it flows. Dane's cell needed to be kept active, kept focused on productive targets, and kept away from the Kess manifest stream for the remaining operational window, approximately 16 weeks, the time required to complete the lung transplantation, the final needle extractions, and the helmet removal sequence. He had spent 6 weeks identifying the target that would accomplish this. The answer was the Quat Drive Yards' secondary construction bay. Specifically, the bay currently completing the structural framework of a new Imperial Star Destroyer, the construction timeline classified at the highest Imperial security level, the vessel intended as Palpatine's personal reserve asset. Not the primary yards, which were under the heaviest security, and which a cell of Dane's size had no realistic prospect of penetrating. The secondary bay, which was secured at a level calibrated to its official classification as a routine construction project, and which therefore had exploitable gaps that a competent team with good intelligence could navigate. The intelligence would come from an anonymous source, a data packet transmitted through a rebel-adjacent frequency that Dane's cell monitored. Formatted to look like a leak from a disaffected Imperial contractor, containing accurate technical specifications for the secondary bay's security protocols that Vader had drawn from his own classified access, and sanitized of any identifying Imperial origin. The packet contained everything Dane needed to plan the operation. It also contained, embedded in the technical specifications in a way that was not detectable as embedded, not hidden, simply present in the natural complexity of the data, a subtle error in the security rotation timing that would cause her team to arrive at the secondary bay during a 40-minute window when the security overlap was thinner than standard, but not so thin as to be suspicious. The operation would succeed. The secondary bay's construction data would be extracted. The Rebel Alliance would receive genuine intelligence about a genuine Imperial asset. Dane would have a significant operational victory. And for 16 weeks, her cell's attention, resources, and analytical capacity would be entirely consumed by planning, executing, and reporting the quad operation, leaving no bandwidth for the anomaly in the Kess manifest stream. He had transmitted the packet 4 months ago. The packet's reception had been confirmed not through any direct contact. There was no direct contact, no communication channel, no relationship, but through the monitoring he maintained on Rebel frequency activity in the Quat sector. Traffic had increased in the expected pattern within 72 hours of transmission, the specific signature of a cell that had received actionable intelligence and begun the planning cycle. Over the following weeks, the traffic pattern evolved precisely as he had modeled. Initial analysis, resource assessment, coordination with Alliance Command, preliminary site reconnaissance. They were going to do it. He tracked the operations development the way he tracked everything at this stage of the larger project, as a variable requiring monitoring to ensure it remained within its expected parameters, addressed in the hour he allocated each evening aboard the Executor to operational security review, alongside the surveillance layer assessments and the diagnostic deception checks. The quad operation was running on schedule. Dane's cell would execute in approximately 3 weeks. The window he required would remain clear. He was in the sanctum when the lung tissue reached full maturity. The culture unit status indicator had shifted from amber, the cultivation phase, to a steady blue that indicated structural completion, which the Kaminoan cultivation notes described as the point at which the tissue had differentiated fully and was capable of sustaining independent biological function given adequate oxygenation. He had been checking the indicator twice daily for 2 weeks, and when it shifted he was sitting at the workbench reviewing the transplantation procedure for the 43rd time. And he noted the change without ceremony and set down the data pad and looked at the unit for a long moment. The tissue inside it was his, built from his cells, grown according to a methodology designed for clone troopers, but adapted across 14 months of preparation for his specific physiological requirements. Functional lung tissue. Mature, ready, waiting. He had 1 surgical preparation remaining before the transplantation could proceed. The removal of the diaphragmatic interface component in the suit's torso section, a substructure he had not yet addressed because it required a period of pre-surgical tissue preparation at the transplantation sites. He had begun that preparation 6 weeks ago. The preparation was complete. The transplantation itself was not something he could perform alone. He had known this from the beginning. The lung transplantation required a second pair of hands, not because the surgical technique exceeded his capability. He had mastered the procedure through simulation to a standard he assessed as adequate, but because the procedure required simultaneous management of the transplantation site and the life support bridge that would maintain oxygenation during the transition window. A single operator transplantation would require him to interrupt the life support bridge to manage the surgical site, and the interruption window was longer than his currently compromised respiratory function could sustain. He needed a surgeon. Finding the surgeon had been the second major procurement challenge of the entire operation, and it had taken longer than the Beskar. Dr. Tan Cray had not been found through the Kaminoan archive. She had been found through a different thread entirely, a post-imperial academic placement record, accessible through the Imperial Science Directorate's personnel database, that listed a Kaminoan geneticist of exceptional qualification as the lead researcher on a tissue cultivation study at a private research facility on Vander. The facility was real. The study was real. Cree had been there for 4 years following the closure of the Kaminoan facilities, continuing her work in reduced circumstances with reduced resources, and, Vader had determined from a careful reading of her publication record, a complete absence of interest in the political context of her employment. She asked no questions about her employers. She asked questions about the biology. This was the quality he required. The approach had been made through an intermediary, a procurement agent who arranged specialist scientific consultations for high-security Imperial research projects, a role that existed and that Vader had used on 2 previous occasions for legitimate purposes. The agent had contacted Kree with an offer, a classified consultation, undisclosed location, undisclosed subject, compensation at 3 times her annual research budget, with a security non-disclosure requirement as standard for Imperial contracted work. She had accepted within 48 hours. He had not told her what the consultation involved. He would tell her when she arrived, which was in 6 days, which was 4 days after Dane's cell executed the quad operation and consumed the last of the available rebel analytical attention in this sector. The timing was not coincidental. Kray's transport to Mustafar would pass through the Quat sector. A rebel cell actively executing a high-priority operation in that sector would not have resources to monitor unusual transport traffic. The window would be clean. He wrote in the datapad, Kree arrival, 6 days. Transplantation window, 8 to 10 days post-arrival, pending pre-surgical assessment. Thoracic needle series, 4 remaining. Minimum extraction interval maintained. He looked at the culture unit. The blue indicator was steady. He thought about Dane, her cell moving toward Quat in the belief that they were acting on a genuine intelligence windfall, that their operational success was the result of their own capability and the fortunate leak from a disaffected contractor. They would succeed. The success would be real. The intelligence they extracted would be genuine and valuable to the Alliance. They would never know the operation was a gift. They would never know the gift's purpose. He sat with that for a moment. Not with guilt. Guilt was not the relevant category. With the recognition that the Grandmaster's move was the one that gave the other players something real, something they genuinely wanted, while ensuring that the board position it created was exactly the one you required. Palpatine had done this to him for years. He had finally learned to do it back. He closed the datapad and went to make arrangements for Dr. Kree's arrival. Dr. Tan Krey arrived on Mustafar at 0600 hours and did not react to the planet. This told him something. Most beings who arrived on Mustafar for the first time reacted to it, the heat shimmer visible from the landing approach, the ash particulate in the upper atmosphere turning the sky the color of an old bruise, the smell that the landing bay's filtration system reduced but could not eliminate, a sulfurous mineral quality that registered in the throat before the nose. Krey stepped off the transport, looked at the landing bay with the specific attention of someone cataloging an environment rather than experiencing it, and turned to face him. She was tall, even by Kaminoan standards, nearly 2.5 meters, the long neck and pale gray-white skin of her species, giving her a quality of stillness that most beings of that height did not possess. Her eyes were large, orange-amber, adapted for the low-light conditions of Kamino's perpetually storm-covered surface. She looked at him the way she had looked at the landing bay. She catalogued him. "Lord Vader," she said. Her voice was precise and unhurried. "I was told the consultation subject would be disclosed on arrival." "It will be," he said. "Follow me." She followed him without asking where they were going. She observed the fortress's interior with the same cataloging attention she had given the landing bay, noting, he suspected, the age of the construction, the volcanic rock integration, the specific quality of the environmental systems. She asked no questions about any of it. He took her to the briefing room on sublevel 3. Not the sanctum. Not yet. The briefing room was where he would give her the information she needed to decide whether she would proceed. He had not brought her to Mustafar under duress. She was here under contract, and she would leave under contract, with compensation, with a transport, and with a non-disclosure agreement enforced by the kind of implicit understanding that came from knowing who had hired her. If she declined, she would leave with everything except the knowledge of what was in the culture unit. He sat across from her at the briefing room's single table and told her what he required. He did not tell her who he had been before the suit. He told her the physiological facts, the damaged lung tissue, the suit's respiratory dependency, the culture unit's contents, the transplantation procedure he had designed and its requirement for a second operator. He told her the timeline. He told her the risks, which were significant and which he presented without reduction. She listened without interrupting for 11 minutes. Then she said, "You grew the tissue yourself." "Yes, from your own cellular baseline, using the Kaminoan deep tissue cultivation protocol, a modified version." She was quiet for a moment. The modification, was it to the cultivation medium composition or the maturation cycle timing? Both. The standard protocol's maturation cycle assumes a clone baseline, accelerated cellular division, higher growth factor receptor density. My baseline required a longer cycle and a modified medium to prevent the tissue from over-differentiating before structural completion. She looked at him for 3 seconds. "That modification is not documented anywhere in the archive." "No, you derived it independently." "Yes." Another silence. Longer. "Show me the tissue," she said. In the sanctum, she stood before the culture unit for 4 minutes without speaking. He let her look. She moved around it, examined it from multiple angles, requested the cultivation log from the datapad. He gave it to her, the specific log, not the others, and read through 14 months of notations with the speed of someone for whom dense biological data had no friction. When she looked up, her expression had changed fractionally. Not warmth. Something more specific. The expression of a scientist who had encountered a result that exceeded the parameters she had assigned in advance. "The tissue is viable," she said. "Structurally complete. Integration ready." She set the datapad down. "The transplantation procedure you've designed is sound in principle. The life support bridge architecture is correct. The sequencing is correct." She paused. "The incision approach for the left lower lobe site will cause more disruption than you've accounted for. The scarring from the original emergency surgery has created a fibrous layer beneath the pleural surface that your model doesn't fully reflect. The approach needs to be modified. Show me." She picked up the stylus from the workbench and modified his diagram in 4 places. Each modification was precise and took less than 30 seconds to notate. He looked at the revisions. They were correct. He had not seen the fibrous layer issue because his internal scan data, obtained with a modified medical scanner rather than a dedicated imaging system, had insufficient resolution at the pleural surface depth to resolve it. "Agreed," he said. She looked at him again with the cataloging expression. Then she said, "I'll need 6 hours to prepare." The surgery took 4 hours and 19 minutes. He was conscious throughout. This was not bravery or preference, it was necessity. The life support bridge required active management from both operators, and the bridge monitoring system needed him awake and capable of responding to the bridge's status indicators. He had prepared for this with a nerve block protocol that managed the surgical site's pain without systemic sedation. A compound he had formulated across 6 weeks of pharmacological calculation and prepared in the sanctum's auxiliary equipment. The nerve block was adequate. Not complete. Nothing involving the thoracic cavity was going to be complete, but adequate. He was aware of the procedure. He could track its progress. When Cree made the Cree-modified approach to the left lower lobe site, he felt the difference between her technique and what his original approach would have produced, and the difference confirmed that her revision had been correct. He focused on the bridge status indicators and on his breathing, which was being managed by the suit's filtration system throughout the procedure. The helmet remained on. The helmet would remain on for now. That was the last piece, and it was not today's work. Cray worked without speaking except to communicate surgical status, brief, precise statements of progress that told him exactly what he needed to know, and nothing additional. She did not ask questions about the scarring she encountered, about the specific damage architecture of the original emergency surgery, about what had caused any of it. She was the most efficient being he had worked alongside in recent memory. In the 3rd hour, when the first lobe was seated and the vascular integration was underway, she said, "Without looking up from the surgical site, the tissue is integrating faster than the protocol predicts. The nerve density at the transplantation site is higher than clone baseline," he said. "More integration points. Faster vascular uptake. You anticipated this. I noted it as possible. Your cultivation log flagged it as probable," she said. "There's a difference." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes, you were being conservative in your documentation. I was accounting for the possibility that the scan data was incomplete." She made a sound that was not quite acknowledgement and not quite disagreement, and returned to the surgical site. The life support bridge was removed at hour 4. The suit's respiratory system, which had been managing his oxygenation throughout the procedure, was still running. The question, the only question that mattered, the question that the 14 months of cultivation, and the 4 hours of surgery, and the 6 years of everything before them had been building toward, was whether it still needed to. He told Kree to monitor the bridge disconnection. She positioned herself at the monitoring station. He disconnected the bridge. He breathed. Not through the suit. Through the transplanted tissue, newly integrated, vascularized, receiving oxygenated blood from the surgical site's connection to his circulatory system, exchanging gases across a membrane that was his own cells. Grown in a cave on a volcanic planet, by his own design. The breath entered and left without mechanical assistance. He took 3 more. The tissue responded to each one, not perfectly, not at full capacity. The integration was hours old, and the tissue needed weeks to fully calibrate to his physiological demands. But it responded. It worked. His lungs worked. He said nothing for a long time. Kree watched the monitoring indicators and said, "Oxygenation is at 61% of projected capacity. This will increase over the coming weeks as integration completes. It is sufficient for low exertion function. You will need to manage exertion levels for approximately 3 weeks." "Understood. You should also know," she said, still watching the indicators, "that the tissue's integration rate suggests full capacity will exceed the projected baseline. The higher nerve density I mentioned, it applies to the tissue response as well. You may find the final function is better than the model predicted." He looked at the ceiling of the sanctum. The basalt above him, 40 meters of rock, the volcanic planet breathing its geological breath overhead. He took another breath, his own. 3 weeks later, at 0300 hours, he descended to the sanctum alone. The transplanted tissue was at 87% integration. Kree had departed Mustafar 11 days prior. Her compensation transferred, her transport arranged, her non-disclosure understanding in place. She had said, "At the landing bay before boarding, the modifications you made to the cultivation protocol, they should be documented. They represent a significant advancement on the standard methodology. They are documented," he said. She had looked at him once more with the cataloging expression. Then she had boarded without further comment. In the sanctum, he stood before the workbench and looked at what remained. The suit's casings were new systems over the Beskar framework. The chest architecture was the matrix. The needles, the final 4 thoracic, extracted over the preceding 3 weeks in the recovery windows between surgical monitoring sessions, were gone. All 26. Gone. The datapad's extraction log was complete. 1 piece remained. He reached up and released the collar ring. The magnetic seal disengaged. He lifted the helmet. The air of the sanctum entered his lungs directly. His own lungs. His own tissue. His own breath. And it was not recycled, not filtered through the ozone compound of the suit's system, not processed, and returned to him stripped of everything a real atmosphere contained. It was the air of a cave on Mustafar, mineral and warm and faintly sulfurous, and the most complex sensory experience he had encountered in 6 years, because it was real and it was direct, and there was nothing between him and it. He breathed it. He set the helmet on the workbench and looked at the wall. At the name. His face. In the polished surface of the Beskar test plate he had positioned there months ago anticipating this moment, was scarred and angular and older than he had been when he last saw it without the intermediary of a distant viewport reflection. The eyes were brown. The scars across the left jaw and temple were significant. The Mustafar burns had not been kind to that side. And the years had settled the damage into something permanent and clearly legible as damage. He looked at it for a long time. Not with grief. Not with the complex negation of grief that he had spent years mistaking for strength. With the attention of someone seeing something clearly for the first time in a long time, and finding that the clarity itself, regardless of what it revealed, was worth having. The respirator was silent. He was breathing. He was breathing and the planet breathed around him, and somewhere above him the Empire continued its patient machinery, and Palpatine sat in his office and believed that the machine he had built was still sealed inside its coffin. He reached for the datapad. He wrote, "Helmet removed. 0312 hours. Respiratory function. self-sustaining. All neuro-interface needles, extracted. Limb systems, Beskar lattice, full function. Chest architecture, matrix integrated. Force lightning vulnerability, neutralized. He looked at what he had written. Then below it, for the last time in the handwriting of the name on the wall, one piece at a time. Complete, he did not put the helmet back on. He spent 3 days on Mustafar doing nothing that required explaining. Not hiding, he had moved past the architecture of hiding, which had been the work of 6 years, and was now complete. He spent 3 days in the sanctum and the fortress, and on the ridge, breathing unfiltered air through his own lungs, wearing the old suit's casings over the Beskar framework for the last time, because certain transitions required a period of sitting still before the next movement. He ate real food, which the suit's systems had never accommodated, and which his body required relearning. Starting with small amounts and building across the 3 days as his restored digestive function calibrated. He slept without the meditation chamber's sealed silence, on a cot in the sanctum, and the sleep was different from the suit's sleep. Deeper, less monitored, the kind of sleep a body took when it was no longer managing its own survival every moment of the night. On the second day he stood on the ridge at midday, in full Mustafar sun, without the helmet's filtered lenses, and looked at the lava plain with his own eyes for the first time since the night he had arrived on this planet in what felt like another existence. The light was extraordinary, harsh and amber and completely without mercy, the way all true things were. On the third day he went to the wardrobe level and began dressing. The new uniform had been finished for 4 months, waiting in a sealed case in the sanctum storage alcove. He had made the final adjustments to the Beskar framework's external layer 7 weeks ago, during the recovery period after the lung transplantation. Working in the sessions between monitoring checks when his hands were steady and his attention was available. He dressed alone. No attendants, no ceremony, no witness. The Beskar under framework seated first, the lattice of both arms and both legs. The chest matrix assembly, the minimal belt integrated power cell array that managed the lightsaber and communication systems. He ran the systems check, everything read at full function. The neural mapping array in both arms registered at 0.038 seconds. The chest matrix registered at full absorption capacity. The power cells registered at 100%. The outer garment layered over the framework in sections. Deep charcoal at the core. Midnight blue at the shoulder structure, the colors of deep space. Of the space between stars where nothing moved because nothing needed to. Not black. He had worn black for 6 years because Palpatine had dressed him in it. Because black was the color of a tool, a weapon, a thing that existed to be used. These colors were different. These were the colors of distance, of patience, of something that had been very far away for a very long time, and had now returned. The pauldrons seated over the shoulder structure of the Beskar lattice, the forearm guards, the shin protection, the partial armor system, Beskar black, fitted precisely to the body beneath it, not the performed body, not the body the suit had announced to every room it entered, but the actual body, scarred and functional and entirely his. No helmet, no mask, no breathing apparatus, no chest box with its status indicators and its life support readouts, and its 6 years of mechanical breathing filling every room with the sound of a machine, keeping a remnant operational. He stood at the full-length mirror panel in the wardrobe level and looked at himself. The reflection looked back. A scarred face above a dark uniform, the left side carrying the permanent record of Mustafar. The jaw and temple damage that no amount of time would fully resolve, the kind of scarring that had settled into the architecture of the face and become part of its structure rather than something imposed on it. Brown eyes, clear, carrying the specific quality of attention that came from having looked at things very directly for a very long time. Hands in Beskar beneath fitted charcoal gloves, at rest at his sides with the stillness of hands that did not need to manage their own weight anymore. He looked at himself for a long time. What he saw was not the boy from Tatooine. That boy was 40 years gone, and the distance was not grievable. It was simply the distance between a beginning and where a beginning leads. What he saw was not Darth Vader, the black instrument, the breathing announcement, the machine in the coffin. That construction had been Palpatine's most patient work, and it was finished. What he saw had no complete name yet. it would be named by what it did next. He arrived on Coruscant without announcement. His shuttle landed on the Imperial Palace's private receiving platform at 2100 hours. The platform reserved for Palpatine's personal use and accessible without prior clearance to exactly 2 beings in the Empire. The duty officer at the platform's security station saw the shuttle's identification transponder, checked it against the access registry, and then sat very still for approximately 4 seconds before opening the bay. He walked through the Imperial Palace without the suit. The effect was different from what he had expected, and precisely what he should have anticipated. The suit had always preceded him, its sound, its silhouette, its particular quality of presence that every being in the Empire had been conditioned to register as a threat before the conscious mind caught up. The corridors he moved through now registered something, but it was not the same thing. It was quieter, and in certain ways worse, because the suit had announced what was coming and given the corridor's occupants time to arrange themselves around the known quantity. This gave them nothing to arrange around. Imperial officers and functionaries who encountered him in the palace corridors stopped and stared with the particular arrested quality of beings whose pattern recognition systems had found no match and were waiting for instruction from a higher process that was also failing. He did not stop. He did not explain. He walked to the throne room. Palpatine felt him coming. He had always felt Vader coming, the dark side signature, the Force presence, the specific texture of pain converted to power that had been as recognizable as a voice for 6 years. He felt it now, felt it approaching down the corridor toward the throne room, and it was wrong. The texture was correct. The performance had held, even now, even at the end. Vader had maintained the performance to the final approach, but something beneath the texture was different. A density, a weight, a quality of presence that had not been there before. Palpatine sat in the throne. The Red Guards flanked him. His expression, when the doors opened, was the expression of a man who had already begun calculating. He looked at what walked through the doors. The calculation did not complete. "My lord," Vader said. His voice was different without the suit's vocabulator. Not weaker. Nothing about it was weaker. But human in a way the vocabulator had not been, carrying register and texture and the particular quality of a voice that had not been used for its own purposes in 6 years and was now using itself. Palpatine looked at him for a long moment. The yellow eyes moved across the new uniform, the absent helmet, the scarred face, the hands, with the speed of a mind that had survived 1,000 years of opposition through the ability to assess a situation faster than the situation could develop. "Anakin," Palpatine said. It was the first time he had used that name since Mustafar. He used it now as a gambit, a bid to invoke the architecture of the relationship, the master and the broken apprentice, the father and the wounded son. The name as a chain, as it had always been, as it had worked for 6 years. "No," Vader said. He walked forward. "That name was yours. You gave it to me as a chain. I don't carry your chains anymore." Palpatine rose from the throne. His hands were loose at his sides. His Force presence, the carefully maintained concealment that had fooled 1,000 years of Jedi perception, dropped, not because he chose to drop it, but because concealment requires energy, and he was redirecting his energy toward assessing whether what stood in front of him was something that could be managed. The assessment was taking longer than usual. "You've been busy," Palpatine said. His voice carried the warmth as technique quality it always carried, but underneath the technique there was something that did not often appear in Palpatine's voice, the quality of a being encountering something it had not planned for. 6 years, Vader said. One piece at a time. He ignited his lightsaber. The blue-white blade cast its light across the throne room and across Palpatine's face. Not red, that blade had belonged to someone else's story, the story Palpatine had written for him. This blade was the one he had built himself, in the sanctum, in the dark, for this purpose. Palpatine extended both hands and the throne room filled with lightning. The lightning entered Vader's body at the left pauldron, traveled the full length of the Beskar lattice, reached the chest matrix, and dissipated as heat through the armor panels along his back. He felt the warmth across his shoulder blades. He took one step forward. Palpatine's expression completed its final calculation and arrived at its final answer. The fight was not long. Palpatine was the most dangerous combatant he had encountered in 2 decades of service, and the fight was not long. What 6 years of preparation had produced was not a being who fought Palpatine and won through superior technique. What it had produced was a being who could not be killed by the weapon Palpatine had built into him, who moved at the speed his own nervous system allowed without mechanical lag, who hit with the full force amplified strength of the body Palpatine had intended to keep caged, and who had spent 6 years in the dark thinking about nothing else. It was enough. In the hours afterward, as the Imperial Palace arranged itself around the new reality in the throne room, Vader descended alone to the wardrobe level. He went to the maintenance bench he had set up during the 3 days before departure. The old black armor was spread across it. Helmet, chest plate, arm casings, leg casings, all the pieces he had been replacing one at a time across 6 years, arranged in the approximate shape of what it had contained. He looked at it. Not with hatred, not with the complex grief of something lost, with the attention he gave to things that had been true and were now finished. It had kept him alive. It had also been the instrument of his diminishment, and both of these things were accurate, and neither cancelled the other. He turned from it and walked toward the throne room. He did not look back. The Empire would learn, in the years that followed, that it had changed masters without changing itself, that it had traded a broken machine for something worse, in the accounting of such things, a sovereign who was whole, who was patient, who had spent 6 years learning that the truest power is not what you can destroy, but what you can endure, dismantle, and rebuild, one piece at a time. In the dark, alone, because no one in the galaxy believed it was possible. The galaxy had feared Darth Vader. The galaxy had not yet learned to fear what Darth Vader became when no one was watching. It would learn. He took the throne. He took no new name. The old one, the one Palpatine had given him as a chain, would do. But it meant something different now. Not a leash, not a prison. A warning. Let us know what you'd like to see next. The end.